Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, President Biden of the United States spoke after the completion, I should say, of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as the last U.S. Service member left the country. Now, he spoke of, and it was a fairly long speech, so the transcript is out there for those who would like to read the complete speech and who haven't watched it. But one of the interesting parts of that speech was his mention of the fact that the U.S. role, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, and this is something that many people have spoken of since, that the U.S. role in the world may change, or there was at least, sort of an implication in that regard, that the U.S. will be now less interventionist, if that's the correct phrase to use, or just will use less of its military power and more diplomacy along those lines, essentially was the idea that many people got from that speech. How significant a shift would that be? Because certainly we had President Trump, who came into office too, saying that he did not want to be involved overseas, that he wanted to put America first. And will it then be finally President Biden who will then enact an America first, in a sense, policy, in the sense that he will not then be as involved overseas as previous administrations have been? Let's put those issues and others to our esteemed panelists who are joining us from across the U.S. today. We're joined by Dr. Walldorf, who is an associate professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. He's also Shively Family Faculty Fellow. He's also the author of several books. He's joining us this morning from Winston, Salem, North Carolina. Joining us this morning from Clearwater, Florida, is Dr. Bledar Prifti, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of South Florida. He's also the author of U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East, The Case for Continuity. And joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is former U.S. Ambassador Dr. Dennis Jett, who is a professor of international affairs at Pennsylvania State University. He's also the author of 4 books. Dennis, Bledar, and Will, good morning to all three of you, and thank you to all for joining us. Dennis, if I may, I'd like to start with you. How much did you read into that part of Biden's speech about the changing role of the United States in the world? Is it as significant as many of us think it is?
I think it is, but well, the devil, of course, is in the details. I don't think it was ever a choice of the United States being policeman of the world or totally isolationist. I think the question always is, where do you intervene and how do you intervene? And I hope that Biden is able to implement that policy where it's less military and more other measures to influence events. There was never a military solution to Afghanistan. It was never going to be winnable. The country itself, the people itself, the neighbors, the terrain, the fact that it's the biggest producer of opium, poppy, all of those went into making a situation that was unwinnable militarily, and I think we've finally come around to admitting that, and I'm glad Biden took the steps he did. The evacuation was a mess, but it was always going to be a mess. There's no way you can evacuate people in a non-permissive, meaning you don't control a situation, environment, and not have it be a virtual disaster.
What are your thoughts on the speech as well, and how significant a shift this thing may be? Because, again, for a lot of us on the outside of the United States, outside the U.S. borders, this seems fairly significant.
I think it's a significant shift. I think it's, quite frankly, a shift that's been happening for a while in U.S. foreign policy. So, I think that there's been this slow, sort of progressive winding down of what's been going on in, our role in Afghanistan, our role in Iraq and Syria to some extent, and just to piggyback there, I think on what Dennis was saying is I think one of the most important things here too is going to be what it is that presidents, at least for a while going forward, are going to be able to do, and in terms of the restrictions they're going to face domestically. And I think there's a tremendous amount of sort of disillusionment around, these types of interventions with the U.S. public. You see that in the still, 54, 55, 60% support in opinion polls for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think, even though people don't like the mess that was created with the withdrawal, they still support the withdrawal. And that reflects a trend that I think is going to have a very restraining effect on presidents moving forward. So I do think it's a significant shift. it's part of a broader pattern that we've slowly been heading towards, and now we've just sort of hit this cataclysmic end of sorts in Afghanistan. It's been very dramatic.
And Bledar, what are your thoughts on that then? In a world where the U.S. then intervenes less, gets involved less, however you want to term it, what does that then mean for Americans?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that this is a war that is going to end up in the history hall of shame, because it was a war with no purpose and a war with no accomplishments whatsoever. So we had no interest whatsoever to intervene in Afghanistan. Many people may say, well, we wanted to go after bin Laden. But it is, you and I can act irrationally out of revenge. But a state government should not act in an irrational way. So Afghanistan war, in my opinion, was a war of irrationality, a war that was basically driven by some kind of revenge combined with some kind of idealism that was manipulated later in the process to benefit certain powerful groups in Washington, D.C. So it was more an extension of domestic policy than an act of foreign policy. For that reason, I still believe that there won't be any major shift in U.S. foreign policy other than pursuing a more rigid, realistic foreign policy. What does that mean? You say that probably President Biden meant that he's going to rely more on diplomacy. In my view, I think that he's going to avoid, situation in which the U.S. will have to carry the buck for other nations. So that is called, back passing. So we're going to pass the burden of containing certain threats around the world to regional states instead of having the U.S. intervene for no reason when we have the opportunity to basically let other nations take care of themselves or threats around the world. So it is more a buck passing strategy than a reliance on diplomacy. That's my view of it.
Dan, certainly I want your thoughts on what was said by the other two guests, but I also wanted to add this on. For some, the fear would be that, listen, just because we're not announcing that we're in a war on the part of the U.S., I'm saying, that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of a war being waged. Now I'm speaking here then about drone warfare, right? So this is sort of out of sight, out of mind, this is sort of the joystick warfare, however we want to term it. And that very much may very well still continue. I mean, that's still occurring in places like Somalia, for example, as well, or has at least till fairly recently. Is that then the way the U.S. will go? Because that will be with less, less casualties on its side, for sure.
Right. As you point out, that one of the reasons that was popular, and it got very popular, it started under Bush, got very popular under Obama, because there were no casualties. You weren't putting American soldiers at risk. And we've already said that we're going to have this over-the-horizon capability, and we've already had 2 drone strikes since the collapse of the government and the takeover of the Taliban. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the intelligence for that second drone strike in particular, where it was supposedly a carload full of suicide bombers, if that intelligence for that to make that strike didn't come from maybe the Taliban itself. In any event, that's going to continue to be an option. I hope it gets used less than it did under Obama or under Trump, because even though it has potential for fewer casualties for the American side, it's still, I think it creates more terrorists than it eliminates. I think the whole threat of terrorism, and I say this as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I think the whole threat of terrorism ever since 9/11 has been overplayed. We lose more people in a couple days to COVID or to opioid overdoses than we ever do in the last 20 years. To terrorism. And so in terms of our own interests and in terms of the way we interact and react to these situations where you have groups that say they're Islamic terrorists, I think, I hope we do it a lot more sophisticated and intelligent kind of way. But you're right, we do have that drone capability, and it is there to be used, and it probably will be, just hopefully more selectively.
Will, then again, I keep saying for those of us on the outside of the U.S., especially in this region and otherwise, does that then mean in some ways that this is just going to be a different form of involvement in countries around the world on the part of the U.S., where again, because it is out of sight and out of mind for many of the American public, that this will still continue and there will be less than political fallout for any mistakes or collateral damage, as we may say?
Well, I think, certainly the greater turn to drone warfare, especially, obviously it started with the Bush administration, accelerated under the Obama administration. I think that had a lot to do with the fact that it was a cheaper option, especially in terms of potential loss of life for Americans. And it was a way that was seen to control terrorism. And yes, it comes with all of the collateral damage in terms of the fallout that was just mentioned. But I do think that's sort of the foundation for where it came from. And it could be a tool that's used more. At the same time, I'm hopeful that it is a last resort, and it is something that the United States uses much less. And I'm hopeful that the United States, for instance, in a place like Afghanistan, can think about working, and there's some hint of this, of course, yesterday from the Pentagon, and I think this will continue, but working with the Taliban, other partners on the ground to manage threats, especially threats that are of global reach. So I think that's another important distinction that hopefully U.S. policymakers will take, is to be very discriminating in what is a threat and what isn't a threat when it comes to terrorism. Some of these terrorist organizations don't have the capacity to hit the United States. ISIS-K doesn't right now, for instance. So, you would hope that there would be greater discrimination. Unfortunately, we're at a moment where there's a lot of excitement over ISIS-K because of the bombing at the Kabul airport, which sort of probably led to some of Biden's comments, the other day about going after ISIS-K. Yeah. But, you hope that there's some greater discrimination that comes there, too.
What are your thoughts about that? Because, the argument would still very much be on the part of many that, listen, the U.S. should not be using the drones because they're an imperfect medium to attack. And yes, I know that they're spoken of as very precise, and certainly at times they certainly can be very precise. But then because of the collateral damage that as Dennis there mentioned and as Will alluded to as well, this can actually hurt the cause more than help it.
Well, I agree with not using the drones. I don't see any reason why we should use the drones. What is our objective, the final objective behind using the drones? Well, to fight terrorists? Well, what is our national security strategy in this case? I don't think, in my opinion, that ISIS or other terrorist organizations are indeed a security threat to the United States of America. As evil as they are, I don't believe that they are a security threat to us. I view them more as a regional competition between states. They use these terrorist organizations to advance their own objectives, and we should not be part of that, regional fight. We should basically stay outside, use diplomacy, as President Biden now is, saying, and intervene whenever we have a direct national security interest, at stake. In this case, terrorist organizations, I repeat, as evil as they may be, they are not a national security threat to the U.S. Even ISIS, going back to ISIS back then, it was not a national security threat to the U.S. It was more a tool used by regional states to advance their own geostrategic interests. And we should not be part of it in any way, because even when we use drones, we are using millions of American dollars, money of the American people. So we should stop doing that, because it serves more the interest of certain special interest groups in Washington than the interest of the United States of America. And we should stop this hijacking of U.S. foreign policy from certain organizations, kind of exploiting the U.S. to enrich themselves. That should stop, and I think President Biden is on the right track to do that.
I want to take advantage of the fact that we may be seeing more diplomacy on the part of the U.S. if we're to believe Biden and what his strategy may be going forward. And because, just last week he had that meeting with Bennett, Naftali Bennett of Israel. And Bennett had, of course, come into the country very specifically wanting an agreement on Iran and not having the U.S. re-enter that deal, even the JCPOA, even though that is certainly not a guaranteed thing at this point. But do you think that, and I'm just using Iran as an example, that will be, for example, something that Biden will very much want to accomplish? And then is that then the way the U.S. will try to deal with its adversaries going forward?
Well, I think it's an example, a good example, and certainly I think Biden does want to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. And I mean, what did Trump accomplish by leaving it? Nothing. He said, "Oh, we're going to pressure them. We're going to, basically, we're going to use economic sanctions to force them to their knees and capitulate and do everything we want." Well, that didn't work out because Iran is not going to buckle to that kind of pressure, and so the number of centrifuges increased, the amount of enriched uranium increased, and they got that much closer to the breakout time necessary to construct a nuclear weapon. And so it did nothing to lessen the potential for a nuclear weapon in Iran, and did a lot to promote it. And so I think going back to the deal is the best thing I think in the region going to do. They're all going to want to acquire a nuclear weapon. Acquiring nuclear weapons does not make you safer. It only robs your government of an ability to help their own people and to spend on things like health and schools and other kinds of things, but it doesn't make you safer.
All right, quickly running out of time, so I want to give both Will and Bledar time for just final comments. We just have literally 2 minutes left, so Will, in just under a minute if you can, on the Iran nuclear deal, what are your thoughts on that?
So I would agree with all of that about the value of that. I think the administration is going to try and move in that direction, continue to push that forward. I think that could have healthy benefits for our relations with our allies in Europe. I think in the wake of Afghanistan and the criticism that President Biden has faced, he's going to have some domestic pushback against that, especially from Republicans. So that could be a very sort of challenging road ahead there for him when it comes to selling that at home.
And Bledar, will it be Biden who will then go down this path of re-entering the JCPOA?
I'm not sure about entering that agreement again, but what I see is that the decision to leave Afghanistan, to me, is also a decision to get closer to Iran, because leaving Afghanistan would be detrimental to Iran, and I think probably U.S. is going to get closer to Iran and trying to kind of use that balance of power in the region to benefit the U.S. And I am not certain whether the U.S. is going to re-enter the agreement, but Iran and the U.S. are going to get closer and closer. And the most important thing is that, in my view, what is more important is what is not stated, what is not written on paper when it comes to the U.S.-Iran relationships. That's what is more important.
Very good. Well, we'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate Bledar, Will, and Dennis for taking their time out of their busy schedules this morning to speak to us and to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there President Biden's speech, which he gave right as the last service member of the United States left Afghanistan, the U.S. withdrawal being, for all intents and purposes, completed, even though there are certainly quite a number of U.S. citizens still left in Afghanistan, or those who have to still be evacuated. But on top of that, him talking essentially about the fact that the U.S. will be less militarily involved overseas and that it will be using diplomacy more. Certainly, I'm paraphrasing his words. And we're all, outside the country at least, outside the United States, waiting with bated breath to see that sort of thing happen, because that's been something that many people around the world have been asking for, that less U.S. involvement is sometimes a good thing. Let regions figure out their problems on their own. Let differences be bridged by countries on their own without necessarily the U.S. playing a role on either side. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a report which pretty much comes out on a yearly basis through the FBI. And data shows that in the year 2020, hate crimes in the United States, across the United States, had hit a 12-year high. And those hate crimes certainly include especially members of the African American community, as well as, of course, the Asian community, and the Asian community targeted in large part because of the pandemic and a lot of the rhetoric that had been used on the part of some politicians, as well as some on the far right, blaming them essentially for the pandemic in many ways. Now, one of the interesting things about the numbers is that a lot of people keep insisting that these numbers are not actually the true figure. And one of the quotes that came out of the Attorney General, and I want to in fact read off that quote directly, is that while these numbers are disturbing on their own, the fact that so many law enforcement agencies did not participate is inexcusable, and the fact that over 60 jurisdictions with populations over 100,000 affirmatively reported 0 hate crimes is simply not credible, end quote. I found that very, very interesting, because that's something that I want to discuss, in fact, with our guests who are joining us today. We're joined by Brian Levin, who is a professor of criminal justice at California State University at San Bernardino. He's joining us this morning from San Diego, California. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Rashawn Ray, who is a Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. Rashawn and Brian, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us today. Brian, I'd like to start with you. Firstly, just overall on the fact that we've hit a 12-year high in the year 2020. How do you reflect on that?
Thank you so much for your introduction. A couple of things. There are all kinds of limitations with various data. And even with the deficiencies, which I'm going to discuss right now and address your question, they're incredibly accurate, though, with respect to trends and when they occur. So we took apart almost 30 years of FBI data and could see when hate crimes spike. One point about 2020 now, okay? 7759 is the highest we've had since 2008. But if you look a little closer, Ohio basically did not report. They reported only a few dozen when they usually report hundreds. So if we include the estimate of what Ohio would be, that would put us as one of the worst years since hate crime data collection started in 1992, and indeed make 2020, with over 8,000 hate crimes, the worst year since 2001, which is the worst year since hate crime data collection has taken place. One last point.
Sure.
Up until very recently, the majority of hate crime victims did not report. A separate government study shows that now about 54% do. But we have massive underreporting with respect to hate crime by victims, and also issues with regard to police compliance with this voluntary program, which I believe should be made mandatory.
Yeah, Sean, it boggled my mind, right, when I read that quote of the Attorney General, that this is even a voluntary thing for law enforcement agencies across the country to do, as in they can choose not to report, because that's on top of the challenge that Brian there mentioned, that many people simply, in fact, do not report if they are the victim of a hate crime, or alleged hate crime at least. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, what Dr. Levin is exactly right. It comes down to data. It comes down to what is required. And there are a lot of agencies, law enforcement agencies, that simply do not submit this information. Sometimes it's not solely because they don't want to. Oftentimes they are completely under-resourced. But make no mistake, there are definitely some that do not want to report these types of data. I think the other thing that's important is that the lack of focus on hate crimes then means that people are less likely to come forward to report, because they don't think that anything is going to happen, or they're going to be re-traumatized having to relive that moment. So as we think about the importance of data, it's extremely important for the federal government to scale up the requirement to force law enforcement agencies to submit and also collect this information. And I think that is one fundamental problem that we have in the United States. We don't have the proper data, but we do know, as Brian noted, that this is definitely a huge trend and a huge problem in the United States.
So, Brian, what are the causes of this? I mean, one obvious one that we can point out is especially the hate towards the Asian community was because of the pandemic. Is that down to politicians? Who is responsible in that regard? And of course, then, as always, the African American community bears the brunt of many hate crimes as well.
Yes, excellent point. A couple of quick things. Just structurally, one of the things that we see with hate crime are traditionally, for instance, Jews are the #1 religion targeted, African Americans the #1 race. But there is a lot of realignment that goes on. Different groups get carouseled in during particular years. So last year, just bear with me, 2020 was a big year with regard to racial hate crimes. And we saw a rising tide that lifted all ships, but anti-Asian and anti-African American went up quite a bit. So did anti-white, interestingly enough. Religion hate crimes, listen to this. Anti-Semitic, which was having multi-year highs in 2019, went down significantly, along with anti-Muslim. But hold on a second. I think a lot of this was due to the pandemic, the political invective around it, and the COVID restrictions, which limited many types of gatherings and redirected, for instance, an anti-religious bias from the year before to be now manifested in racial crimes. So we had the lowest anti-Muslim that we had, anti-Muslim number of hate crimes that we've had since before 9/11. So that's a good thing. Unfortunately, what we've done just today, I'm sorry, not just today, but just recently, was elevate our conflict advisory because of what's going on with respect to Afghanistan and elsewhere, and knowing about these anniversaries. The first anniversary of 9/11 was a terrible time for hate crimes in the United States, and it hasn't been gone over since. So with these anniversaries coming up and Jewish religious holidays, we actually are calling for law enforcement and community groups in the United States to be at an elevated level of sensitivity. But bottom line, answer to your question, what makes this stuff go up? I think three things. Overall trends and stereotypes that are present in society, but then immediate catalysts that are then go through a feedback loop online and through influencers that amplify and more specifically direct where this aggression goes. One last point. We're seeing a lot of this now occur around political events and not only manifest itself in the traditional kinds of hate crimes like anti-Black and things like that, but also against government officials and others over things like COVID restrictions. So intergroup conflict is spreading, becoming much more localized, and not just being limited to the traditional categories that we've had, much more an a la carte selection by offenders.
You know, Rashawn, one thing that strikes me is that it seems like I don't want to say jumping from one group to another, but, you know, recently because of what's happened in Afghanistan, and I don't want to talk about the foreign policy section of that, but a lot of far-right groups and white supremacist groups, if I may call them that, are jumping on the bandwagon of hatred towards Afghans who may be showing up in the United States, right? Escaping persecution, those who have possibly worked with U.S. forces and or are just seeking safety from persecution, right? Or are fearing for their lives. And there's a lot of talk about, hey, these people may be terrorists. They'll be bringing over a culture that doesn't mix into ours. I mean, the rhetoric is significantly hateful about these people as well. What, in your opinion, makes society jump from one to the other? I mean, it seems like we're just choosing on a not daily basis. I don't want to overstate that, but as the news comes out, we're just choosing what group to hate on.
So there's a theory that people should know. It's called group threat theory. And part of what this theory asserts is that when there is a sizable proportion of an ethnic group or a racial minority group, then that group starts to pose a political, economic, and cultural threat to the status quo. This is one of the reasons why we see the main groups that are targeted from year to year change. 2020, of course, it was Asians. Of course, Black people and Jews are continuously targeted. But we're again starting to see an uptick for people who are from the Middle East. And part of this speaks to that threat, the normative threat that happens. And to respond to that, what needs to occur is we need to expand our hate crime laws. The hate crime legislation is highly restrictive. In the state of Maryland, we've worked to expand that to make it where race or religion and other protected categories can be one of the reasons, among many, that people might engage in violent acts against other people. The federal legislation mostly says that it solely has to be about one of these protected clauses like race. Well, rarely do people make decisions solely based on one thing. They are making decisions based on multiple things. But if it's race, religion, sexual orientation, nationality, or the like, these should be reasons why we consider it to be hate crimes. And I think this expansion would do really, really good to protect people. Finally, we need to ensure that we get white nationalism and white supremacy out of law enforcement. There's no reason why a person who supports, whether it be going to meetings or even in their attitude support white supremacy, that they would want to report or properly record a hate crime against a group that they vilify. So we have to work there. And there was a Department of Homeland Security report that talked about that the biggest threat to national domestic security in the United States was white supremacy and the way that it was aiming to once again re-infiltrate itself into law enforcement.
You know, Brian, there was that really good book I read in 2019, Hate Incorporated, right? And the reason I'm bringing that up is because it spoke about the fact that hate sells. And I mean, I'm sure it's not the only book that did discuss that. I know that a lot of experts have discussed how hate continues to sell. And this is not certainly unique to the United States. But do you think it's also that there's so much money behind the need to always have hatred towards somebody or the other continuing? There always needs to be a boogeyman?
Yes, and there are a lot of grifters in this area. So, for instance, there are folks out there that falsely say that there is this surplus of hate crime hoaxes, which isn't true. We found 11 out of 7,000 false reports to police or universities in 2018, for instance. There's also an industry that vilifies Muslims, and it involves people who are on a speaking circuit, some television personalities, and interestingly enough, what we've seen, some really interesting things with regard to breaking down the data. So when candidate Trump launched his campaign and spoke derisively against Latinos, it was a busy news cycle, and the number one trending candidates, Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, were launching their campaigns. But once Trump became the leading candidate, we could see blips around, for instance, bigoted statements about Syrian refugees. We would go from 0 to 1 per day anti-Muslim hate crime, for instance, to 2 or 3. Just, kind of blips. And then when we saw later on in that last quarter of 2015, invective politically, the Paris terror attacks, the San Bernardino attacks, and then the Muslim ban 5 days later. Listen to this. The increase that we had at the San Bernardino terror attacks actually went up another 23% after the Muslim ban proposal. Similarly, 6 days after 9/11, when President Bush spoke of tolerance towards Muslims, hate crimes against Muslims went down precipitously the very next day and into the next year. So there's a combination of factors: a catalytic event, social media, and influencers, which then make these stereotypes acceptable and widely dissipated. And that's where people will act upon these things at various levels. Some people will be violent based on these negative stereotypes. Other people will be more discriminatory or avoidant. But that's what you get, and that's why we have to use education and all the levers of our civil society to fight against this.
You know, Rashawn, it's a huge mountain to climb, right? Because some people's entire careers, if we're completely honest, are built on just ensuring that there is hate towards somebody out there. So how does one overcome that?
Well, I think when it comes to thinking about social media, I mean, we've seen some social media platforms, Twitter in particular, Facebook of late, that is aimed to sanction the language that people are using. I mean, Donald Trump was essentially kicked off of Twitter and also off of Facebook. So I think that is one approach. The problem, though, is we have to watch to ensure that people who are trying to combat these issues are also not sanctioned. And there are a lot of people, particularly Black activists, who have been sanctioned in this way. So I think that's one way. I think the other big thing, though, is social media algorithms have to change. The way that social media algorithms are set up, and I've been studying these for years, they are set up to give back to us what they think we want to read, what they think we want to see. So part of what that means is that it is driving people farther into echo chambers, farther into their holes, if you will, to get information that oftentimes might be untrue, that also might be predatory, that might be discriminatory, and might also increase the actions that people are taking. So that is one aspect that we really need to focus on moving forward, is to ensure that there's equity and, of course, people being able to say things that are right, but also having a better algorithm that gives people equitable information and objective information moving forward.
And that's also a huge challenge, isn't it, Brian? Because how does one ensure that people aren't stuck in their echo chambers, as Rashawn there correctly described it, because that's now the issue of social media, right? Where we constantly, are just surrounded by opinions that we like, that, make us feel comfortable in our respective opinions. How does one move beyond that, even if it is someone who has hatred towards somebody else?
Well, you have to want to first. And the best thing Gordon Allport found was meaningful interaction towards goals with diverse folks, like firefighters or something like that. But I think Dr. Ray made an excellent point, and that is we have seen these online spaces become these elastic reservoirs of grievance that would have people who have fears, legitimate questions about various changes that are going on with society and COVID and things like that. But it also would include conspiracists, disinformation folks, and folks who belong to what's called the insurrectionist doctrine of the Second Amendment, which says not that you just have a right to have a gun in your home, but you have a right to armed rebellion. So we have all these cross currents during a time of polarization and decreased trust in communal institutions. It gives an opportunity for extremist and conspiratorial and downright false disinformation to be injected into that marketplace. And included among these entities are folks like Russia. And we had a whole slew of posts that were supposed to be divisive that were injected into Facebook, over 3,500 by the Russians, for instance, in 2016 during the election time. And we saw hate crimes go up, we saw invective online go up, and we saw this disinformation effort go up almost simultaneously. So not all of it is organic. Some of it is due to negligence because the social media companies make money when people are engaged and looking at their screens. And they have to do a better job. And we're looking for legislation in California here to at least have them make a report each year on what they say their own policies require, not putting anything on them other than what are your policies and what has been done over the last year with respect to them.
Sean, if I may play devil's advocate for a moment, we cannot police the way people think, right? So, I mean, if for example, there are correct algorithms put in place or correct measures put in place on the part of social media companies as well as law enforcement to deal with the hatred that people may just, spew verbally or through social media, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will not continue to hold those views, within the confines of their home, for example, and pass that on to their children and the next generation. How does one deal with that then?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think first it becomes about accountability. People can engage in a hate crime, and in some places that be a slap on the wrist compared to doing something else that might be nonviolent. So we have to get to a point where when people engage in hate crimes, they are actually held accountable under law. The second thing, and Dr. Levin brought this up, this is such an important point, that the moment we're in right now in the United States and in many countries around the world, institutional trust is at an all-time low. People do not trust the government as much as they did in the past. People do not trust the media. People do not trust law enforcement. Science and medicine is still okay, but of course it comes out in the media, so that leads to distrust. What that means is then people are even more likely to go into those echo chambers. So one of the things that has to happen, and President Biden has said he's really aiming to play this up, people are waiting to see some of the ways this is going to happen. I think the Office of Managing Budget with the Evidence Act requiring different agencies to be synchronized to provide information, more transparent information to the public is going to help. But the way that this information is communicated is going to be key. So restoring institutional trust is important. Then people will rely on institutional actors. Instead, what is happening now, there is a merger between professional and amateur communicators, and people cannot separate the two. And in the past, people were able to do so. We need to get back to a point where institutional trust is restored that will help people know where to go get information and start to change attitudes and behaviors.
Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate both Rashawn and Brian for taking their time out this morning to share their expertise with us and to put all this into context for us, right? Because these sorts of reports do come out on a yearly basis, but both of our experts there were able to discuss, the waves, in a sense, if I put it that way, towards different groups that come up. And certainly there was a context, and there is still very much the context of the pandemic as we speak, vis-a-vis hate crimes towards Asian Americans, the African American hate crimes towards African Americans has been on a yearly basis increasing, or at the least has been spoken of more, and that has more of a spotlight on it now. Thankfully, that is being acknowledged by authorities as well. But then also, as I put to our guests, there's also, just within the context of political or geopolitical issues, so what's happened in Afghanistan, those who are coming over then, Afghans who are seeking safety from persecution or are just escaping from Afghanistan for other reasons, they're finding that far-right groups and white supremacist groups are picking up on their presence or then coming in seeking asylum as a negative, and a hatred towards them too is something which I think is very important to keep an eye on. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.